On the 11th of February, the final of the 34th Africa Cup of Nations will take place in Côte d'Ivoire, and then we will know who will hold the prestigious trophy in their hand. Who will it be? There are still 4 teams in the running to win: Nigeria, South Africa, the host Côte d'Ivoire, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Football is not necessarily my specialty, but because the cup is not just football, but has significance beyond that, has history, is a pan-African project, I want to take a brief look at the history of the AFCON today, because in my opinion, interestingly, hardly anything describes the history of the African continent better than its football. The very first CAN was organized to mark the Confederation of African Football's, the CAF, official launch in Khartoum in Sudan in 1957, making Africa's continental prize 3 years older than its European equivalent. 1957 was a special year, the year when the first sub-Saharan African state was able to declare its independence from the old colonial power. However, neither Ghana, which was ruled by the charismatic and football-mad Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, nor many other African states were able to take part in the tournament. All other states were still struggling for their independence from the European colonial powers, and so only 3 countries took part in the first competition: Egypt, Ethiopia, and the host country Sudan. South Africa, which was also a founding member of the CAF and wanted to take part, was not allowed to participate. The reason: the apartheid administrators refused to field a racially mixed team. Even though the tournament was officially supposed to be apolitical, they did not want this injustice on the pitch, which is why South Africa was denied participation. South Africa had to wait until the end of the apartheid and thus until the end of international isolation before the team known as Bafana Bafana was allowed to play in the Africa Cup, and surprisingly won on its first appearance. By the way, Bafana Bafana can be translated as boys boys, which is used as a battle cry and means something like go boys, go boys. So football isn't always just football, but somehow also politics. This can also be seen in the electrifying speech by the Ethiopian Yitnekachu Tessema, one of the founding fathers of the CAF, who summarized the vision of the Africa Cup in Cairo in 1974. He said, "I am issuing a call to our General Assembly that it affirm that Africa is one and indivisible, that we work towards the unity of Africa together, that we condemn superstition, tribalism, all forms of discrimination within our football and in all domains of life. We do not accept the division of Africa into Francophone, Anglophone and Arabophone. Arabs from North Africa and Zulus from South Africa, we are all authentic Africans. Those who try to divide us by way of football are not our friends." In a nutshell, football as a force to unite Africa. After 17 African countries gained official independence from the old colonial powers in 1960, the number of teams in the Africa Cup also grew, meaning that qualifying rounds soon had to be introduced. Now, to Nkrumah's great delight, Ghana was finally able to take part, and the Black Stars kicked their way to victory twice in a row. Nkrumah knew about the unifying power of sport, and his Black Stars carried his dream of a united Africa across the continent. By the way, in line with Nkrumah's Pan-Africanism, Ghana's Black Stars borrowed their famous nickname from the Jamaican intellectual Marcus Garvey's shipping line, which was established to take Black Americans back to Africa. If we stay with these nicknames and titles of honor for a moment, we can see that here too, football can break down borders according to the Pan-African dream. The Egyptian Mahmoud Abdelrazek Hassan was nicknamed Shikabala after a Zambian forward, Webster Chikabala, because of the latter's stellar performance at the 1990 Africa Cup of Nations. Or the Ivorian Laurent Pokou, who's called the Asmara Man, because he is associated with the capital of Eritrea. The reason: his 5-goal performance against Ethiopia during the 1968 Cup of Nations. And this year, Gambian Adama Bojang, who played for Steve Biko FC in his home country, played at the AFCON. The club was founded in the Gambia in 1978, 1 year after the South African and father of the Black consciousness movement was murdered by the apartheid police. So, you can never underestimate how much sport, in this case football, can influence people and make history, because it brings people together and inspires them. The Africa Cup produced many more icons, such as Pharaoh's striker Mohamed Diab El Attar, who played for Egypt in the final of the first cup. and scored all 4 goals against Ethiopia. At-Diba, as he was known, remained loyal to the game afterwards, although he swapped his football boots for the whistle. After Egypt and Ghana dominated the tournament for a long time in the first years, the decade of the Central African nations followed in the 70s. The 80s and early 90s were then the era of the West African nations. This era brought forth new heroes. For example, Hassan Shihab, who later celebrated 3 AFCON victories in a row as coach of the Egyptian team. Or the inventor of the blind pass, Lakhdar Belloumi, who scored the decisive goal against West Germany in the 1982 World Cup in Spain. What was scandalous at the time was that Algeria was eliminated after the group stage despite winning because Germany and Austria made a pact and deliberately played like shit. This scandal is also known as the disgrace of Dijon. Algeria was rightly outraged at the time, and this quote from the head of the Austrian delegation, Hans Schack, after the game shows just how deeply racism was embedded in the minds of the Europeans. He said, "Of course they played tactically today, but if 10,000 desert sons want to cause a scandal in the stadium because of this, it just shows that they don't have enough schools." Some sheikh comes from an oasis, gets a taste of the World Cup after 300 years and thinks he can now open his mouth. Pretty cringe and racist. So let's go back to our player icons instead. Of course, I have to mention Thomas Nkono, who's regarded as one of the best goalkeepers in Africa. Fun fact, Gianluigi Buffon decided to become a goalkeeper after watching Nkono's performance at Italia 90 and even named his son after him. Not forgetting, of course, George Weah, who became president of Liberia after his amazing football career. And of course, there are much more icons. But just what I wanted to show you is, you can see here how much football in Africa has accompanied and even influenced current events and history. And a lot has happened since the first AFCON. Where once 3 teams played against each other, there are now 24. But it's not just the number of participants that has changed. More and more African teams, and above all individual footballers, are becoming increasingly present and successful internationally. KMPG report figures show there are over 500 African footballers in European leagues. The number of players playing abroad is far higher if other non-European leagues like the Middle East and China are factored in. So this sounds great at first, but the African teams are complaining about a brain drain because of this. The talents are being bought up by the big and rich non-African clubs. Some of them are then unable to take part in the AFCON or are no longer used to the conditions. In addition, there have long been repeated disputes about the timing of the Africa Cup. Since 1968, the tournament has always been held every 2 years in even-numbered years. But this was changed so that the tournament did not coincide with the World Cup. Since 2013, the tournament has now been held in odd-numbered years. But as you may notice, 2024 is not an odd number. Yes, the fact that the tournament takes place in 2024, but is branded 2023 has another reason. The cup has always been held in winter, as the weather is simply more pleasant for both players and spectators. However, there were complaints from European clubs that the African players wouldn't be able to play in Europe at the main tournament times and demanded that the Africa Cup be held in the summer. And you can imagine how hot it can get on the equator. This has actually been the case since 2019, but an exception had to be made for 2021 due to the COVID pandemic, as well as for the summer of 2023 because it's monsoon season in Côte d'Ivoire, so January, February 2024 was the decision. The pressure from Europe repeatedly led to tension, especially against the background of the former vision of the Africa Cup, which was African solidarity and autonomy, so free from European interventions. So what happened to these aspirations over time? When AFCON was held for the first time, it provided a pan-African stage for the performance of new national identities in a way that most people supported and even embraced, according to the historian Peter Alegi. Today, 67 years later, the idealistic vision of autonomy has given way to commercialism and pragmatism. FIFA and Europe have contributed to this. Nevertheless, the tournament, which brings together 24 African countries, is a successful Pan-African project, which once again provided plenty of cultural exchange, surprises and fun at this year's tournament. So football will continue to accompany current events in Africa. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed my brief history of the AFCON. Tell me if you watch it and who you think will win this year.